Hello, everybody. Welcome to Unlearning Economics. I'm glad to have with me today the blogger, policy wonk, general socialist presence of Matt Bruenig. So we're going to chat a bit about socialism with democratic characteristics, as I put it in the title, but some of the policies that can push forward socialism, how we see socialism, and how we can make attempts at socialism effective. So thanks very much for coming on, Matt.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, so yeah, sorry everybody in the chat. I think there's a lag. Like sometimes I just sit and wait for like 10 seconds. Me and Matt were just waiting, but it always seems to just actually like cut in when I'm talking. So it just takes absolutely ages to upload. But anyway, so Matt, yeah, I mean I've been following. I'm glad we had this talk really because I've been following your stuff for God knows a decade more, ever since you first started blogging, and I think we tend to have quite a lot of areas of agreement. I think there are some areas of disagreement, although I get the sense that they're more cases of emphasis than substance. But could you see yourself as a socialist, right? But you're not what I would consider a typical socialist, especially online. So I was just wondering if you could chat to us a little bit about what socialism means to you and what your vision for socialism is.
Yeah, I have I guess a narrow or skinny view of socialism in a way that is fixated primarily on the ownership of capital and the distribution of the return on capital, and kind of views that as the centerpiece of the whole thing, and everything else as being, somewhat more negotiable. I think a lot of people get into socialism for other reasons, or they think that, once we achieve a different way of managing the capital stock, that will achieve all sorts of other things that they're interested in. I have other things I'm interested in. Obviously, the welfare state, I spend probably the majority of my time on that, though I don't generally regard that as necessarily socialist, depending on each particular benefit and how it's organized and stuff. But I try to stay very pure and narrow when it comes to, socialism qua socialism, which is to my mind, again, just focused on the ownership of whatever you want to call it: capital, real estate, bonds, equity, companies, the productive apparatus, things like that.
Okay, so yeah, I want to expand a little bit more on this view of socialism as primarily about ownership because it's essentially about where income flows to, right, in society, and where the social surplus, you could call it, maybe a leftist or a Marxist might call it that, where that goes. So could you maybe just talk us first through like kind of maybe how that's organized in capitalism and how your view of socialism builds on that?
Yeah, so in capitalism, the ownership of wealth tends to be very heavily concentrated. So in the US, I think it's something like the top 20% or top 10% owns 75% of the wealth, something like that. It varies year to year a little bit. And, there are reasons why that happens that seem unique to capitalism. The whole sort of wealth begets wealth kind of process, right? The more wealth you have, the more income you're able to receive, because you receive not just pay for work, but also you receive the profit share of the economy. And the more income you have, the higher the higher your savings rate is able to be. And these things seem to compound over time. And so that's what you wind up with in that kind of system. And, the socialist alternative, of course, is to spread that out and to do it in a specific way that involves sort of collective institutions instead of attempting to do it through, I don't know, sort of like everyone owns a kind of their own little private share. I know some of the early socialists we're focused on things like what if we kind of gave everyone their own little plot of land or something like that. I don't know that you would even call those people socialists, but they're kind of included in the canon because they kind of saw the same problem but went at it a little bit differently. I would say, the difference, because in the US we do have people who they're worried about the unequal distribution of wealth, and they just tear their eyes out trying to figure out how do we get this more equal while still maintaining the basic structure where everything is done through private holdings and stuff like that. And that seems to be a fairly futile endeavor. No one really comes up with policy ideas that are remotely compelling. So the alternative is through collective ownership instead. And so that's where I tend to focus and think that's the primary focus. We're trying to spread the wealth, but through collective institutions.
I mean, this is like what I don't know if you remember this, but Ed Miliband called it like pre-distribution, right? Is that notion of like you design the institutions so that you have a more equal distribution of income, before taxes was the basic idea, right? Would you say that's in line with what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit different, I mean, I guess it's a definitional question, right? So if you take something like a sovereign wealth fund, for example, like a dividend paying sovereign wealth fund like we have in Alaska, where, they have a big pot of money. Right now it's equal to, I think, about $100,000 dollars per person in Alaska, if you were to kind of think about it that way. But it's managed by the state, and they pay a dividend each year. Last year was like $3,500 to each Alaskan. Um, do we think of that as pre-distribution, or do we think of that as redistribution? How do we
Uh,
understand that dividend, I guess?
yeah.
Is that but yeah, we're trying to capture capital share one way or another, and get it spread out differently, whether through paying everyone an equal dividend or social investment or whatever, you want to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point is, and this comes through in a lot of your writings as well. I guess you don't really care what it's called, right? In a way, and that's
Yeah.
also what differentiates you from a lot of socialists, because you're like, let's just do all these things, right, and they'll be good, right? And we can call them socialism if we want, and we can call them pre-distribution or redistribution or whatever.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are very committed to specific words describing what they're trying to do. I am just naturally not prone to that, but also, there's something nice about the flexibility of if someone wants to say, "Hey, in Alaska, everyone's a capitalist" or something, you're like, Okay, cool." Well, if that's how you want to think about it, we have this big collective pot where everyone has kind of like $100,000 share in, and they each get a dividend. And dude, if you want to say that's everyone's a capitalist, or you want to say
Mm.
that's the most socialist state in the US, you kind of look at it either way, I guess. But at the end of the day, wealth is way more equal in Alaska than it is in any other state, and probably any other country except for maybe Norway, or some other countries that have done something similar.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah. Andrew Yang called the UBI the freedom dividend, didn't he? I think it was
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So if that's
Dividend
got a bigger
apparently
name,
Dividend apparently polls better, I've been told by the people who, do a lot of UBI stuff. And I find that very, you know, perplexing, because I don't know. I just imagine most people don't even really know exactly what a dividend is. But
yeah, that was exactly my thought when you just said that. I guess maybe that just helps. They're just like, oh, this is new and interesting, when it
yeah, oh,
obviously
it's a
isn't.
financial thing. That's
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
Cool. So, I mean, yeah, you've already touched on a lot of different things that I want to get to, but let's just go back to this kind of view of socialism, because there's lots of different ways of organizing the social surplus, the income that goes to people, and I think you've been an advocate of what I would call polycentricity. You might not use such a pretentious term, but it's just like you're happy with state-owned enterprises. I think you're a big advocate of those. You're kind of happy with worker democracy to some extent. You want social wealth funds as well, I think, which you just kind of alluded to, and maybe even some consumer co-ops, right? So these are all different ways of sort of redirecting these income flows to the people, as a socialist would see it.
Yeah, yeah. I think oh, now I'm forgetting his name. There was a book I read when I was pretty young and working through all this stuff. He works at the Democracy Collaborative. Anyways, I think he called it like the checkerboard approach to socialism or something like that. I
Okay.
never really
Cool.
understood the metaphor of the checkerboard with all this, but when he was like, look, because his whole thing is like, look, there's quite a lot of socialist institutions in the US. If you think about it, we do have a lot of public utilities, especially in rural areas. There's the
Mm.
post office, there's the K through 12 schools. We kind of got that, and they look different. And in rural areas, there's a lot of consumer co-ops as well, for electricity and stuff like that. And I don't know, his case was just kind of like, look, there's a lot of different ways to do it, and maybe there's something compelling about kind of just pointing out these institutions and saying, look, we just want more, and different institutions might be appropriate for different things, and but ultimately we're just trying to get everything converted as much as we can into one of these forms, whether it's a state-owned enterprise or a fund or a co-op or whatever. And I thought, that seems sensible, and reasonable, and let's I don't know. It was very persuasive to me as a strategy for, and also as a strategy for persuading others, because it's very approachable if you can say, hey, look at this thing. Like, we just do more of that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that was G.A. Cohen's point, right? He was a philosopher who was talking about that. I don't think he's not the one who came up with the checkerboard term that you just mentioned, but it's sort of like socialism kind of exists in various forms, right? Like we have collective ownership, and we have kind of community organizations, and we have kind of national institutions that redistribute wealth and power. So I think I don't know. I mean, I don't. A lot of people might differ. I think this is where a lot of socialists might differ from us, because when I speak to a lot of online socialists, they seem very keen to differentiate their vision of socialism, and maybe this applies to anarchists too, as much as possible from what we already have. And they're like, oh no, it's a completely revolutionary, radical rethinking of the entire structure of production, of markets, and of everything, right? And it's, we almost can't imagine it because our brains are too capitalist. And I'm not saying, I mean, I said that a little bit facetiously. I'm not saying that's entirely wrong. Like, I think it is difficult to imagine the future, and maybe it will be very different. But it also seems to me that if you're trying to convince people, ordinary people, of the benefits of socialism, then pointing out that it does already exist in their lives is a pretty straightforward way to do that, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, people are scared of change, and you do need to make sure people can understand what you're advocating, I
Mm.
think. And telling people to take a big leap of faith into something that you can't fully describe, and saying, look, our horizons are too limited, and but once we make that leap, then we'll see. It sounds crankish, and I don't think you're going to convince a lot of people of that. I also just think it's, I don't know, to me, if someone comes up to me and is like, I know the truth of where we need to go, I can't really explain it to you. Your mind is too limited. I'm kind of like, but especially the kind of people say like I mean, I don't mean to judge you, but I'm looking at you, and I don't know. I don't know that you're smarter than me. I don't know, but yeah, I think that's approach, and I think there are people, and this happens actually across the political spectrum, where there are, you have political views, like political content, substance that you're interested in, but then you also have a kind of attitude that you have towards your politics. And some people really want to kind of be that, they're trying to communicate their difference, and
Mm.
how kind of distinct and radical they are from the status quo. Like they want to be outsiders in a way. And then there are some people who want to be insiders. They want to seem like, yay, my stuff's very moderate and whatever. On the conservative side, you'll see this a lot with whatever, social conservatism. So sometimes you have social conservatives who are really emphatic about, like, we're the normal people. We're just normal. And all you
Mm,
guys are like wacky libs who want all this kind of. And then you'll have social conservatives who are like, I'm standing alone in a world full of debauchery, and like the whole world is fallen, and but me and my little radical club, and they'll believe the same things about whatever same-sex marriage and things like that, but they just have a very different attitude and presentational style about it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's good to have both. But I think it is worth pointing out as well. I mean, I get this, because I argue with people about this occasionally in my comments, because I'm masochistic. But like, it's like, you know, it is, I mean, in your, I just watched your using corporate governance to understand socialism video, which I think I said the whole title out loud because I think it just completely sums up the approach, right? It sounds like it's kind of dry and it's an accounting exercise or whatever, but it's still very radical for you to say what you essentially say in that video, which is let's get rid of shareholders, right, and
Yeah.
replace them with the people, right? And the people again could be workers, it could be consumers, it could be the entire population, or it could be government employees for state-owned enterprises, right? That's like, you're it's that's very, very difficult to enact. And I think it would require a lot of struggle. You'd be talking about, it's not just like, it seems technocratic, but it's not just like you're saying, oh, yeah, we can do this one policy tweak. Obviously, you can't take all of the capital rights away from the capital owners without pushback. You need strong, unions and other movements and all the rest of it.
Yeah, absolutely. When I mean, I actually think that part of it is more important, even though that's not where I tend to spend my career, I guess, now that I guess you can call it that since I've been doing it for so long. But I made that judgment call actually when I graduated from undergraduate. I decided I was going to become a labor lawyer, and I did become a labor lawyer, and I was a labor lawyer for like a couple of years. End up getting drummed out of that in a weird circumstance that made me do like policy full time. But if you look at, to my mind, the countries that are closest to what I've advocated, which are the Nordic nations,
Mm.
I don't see how they are where they are without their labor movement being as strong as it is, and really kind of running the show for as long as they did. So, I don't have any sort of like, there's some people who they get so interested in the thing they're good at that they're like, oh, just elect me and then I'll change the laws and we're good to go. I don't think, that's the most important piece of it or the hardest piece of it. I think actually figuring out how to like change the institutions, like on paper, I think is relatively straightforward. But getting it done is, I don't know. Like if someone asked me, like, okay, how do we get here from there? Like as a political matter, it's like, well, I don't know. It was support Bernie Sanders was
Yeah.
sort of the answer for a few years, and now I don't really know. So,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm encouraged by the rise in union activity. I have to say. I mean, yeah, across the world, and I think we've had a rise in unionization in the states where you are, right. Here, I don't know if
well,
we've. Oh,
we've had
okay,
some
carry
high
on.
profile campaigns,
Yeah,
but the official stats that come out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics have shown flat.
yeah.
It's been flat.
Oh,
So.
okay. So the actual, yeah. So yeah, it's kind of similar here. I think like I'm not sure that membership's gone up, but action has, and the amount of strikes. I mean, I'm on strike at the moment. Technically, I'm doing a half a strike, which is a marking boycott. So it's like that's just been continuous, and the train strikes here are continual. There was another one last week, and that just seems to be like a feature of life now. I mean, the government are talking about outlawing striking now. Effectively, that's like their solution to the problem. So I don't know if that's very promising, but I don't think even they will be able to get away with that.
Yeah, no, we've had, and I think we've seen a lot of organizing in sectors that haven't been organized before. Starbucks is the most obvious
Mm.
example, but we're seeing it with Trader Joe's, which is a grocery store, REI, which is actually technically a consumer co-op. I actually talked about them in the video. They're having problems with their management and stuff. So we've seen Unions kind of cleverly go through these sort of progressive companies and start unionizing them in sectors where it seemed like before it was
Sure.
impossible, especially due to the structure of the way like union laws work in the US. And so that's been very inspiring. I every few months I have like a Starbucks statistical rundown where I try to aggregate all the stuff like that. And I mean, they're still adding like a store every 2 or 3 days or something to their membership, which is, just unbelievable. But in aggregate, there's still people,
Mm,
there's, because we lose. I mean, every time a business goes under, all those members stop being union members, because of
yeah.
the way it's set up here. So.
Yeah, I mean that's like the sectoral unions, right? The benefit of sectoral unions, right? Whereas they're more employer level, business level in both of our countries.
Yeah, and we actually have the worst case scenario, which is it's establishment level, so it's not even employer level. So,
Yeah.
like every single Starbucks store would technically be its own union. Now they might, coordinate and kind of, enter into a larger structure, but every store, if it goes under, all those workers are, and in each store could be bargains individually, and that's
Mm,
probably what Starbucks is going to try to do is say, no, we need an individual agreement for each of our, I think they now have like 500, 400, 500 stores or something like that. It's just it's so impractical. But
it may. I mean, yeah. Not only so you've got the usual problem of like the businesses can play off the workers against each other, right? And I think the unions sort of end up competing with one another as well, right? It's like they're not, it becomes the opposite of the intent of a union, right? Because you're not all together banding together to bargain for better conditions. You're all just separate, and then it's like, well, you're back to almost square one in terms of bargaining power.
yeah, I mean that definitely has happened at times. I know back when they were unionizing hospitals in California, you had SEIU, and like national nurses and even some strange unions like UAW and stuff like that. They were all fighting over different collections of healthcare workers, and it got really ugly, and there were lawsuits,
Mm,
and there's also like a pernicious element of that, which is that the in theory the employers are just supposed to stay out of all this stuff, but in practice, they interfere, and they might tilt the playing field towards one or another union that they think is maybe less aggressive or something like that. So.
mm. So you did mention Scandinavia, and I wanted to ask you about that because you've been a very vehement defender of the idea that Scandinavia is has more of what you could call socialism than people often make out. So it's often thought of as social democracy, and it is right in one sense, but it is also actually quite socialist by at least by your definition. So could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, as in the US discourse especially, and maybe it's the same over there, the emphasis has always been on the welfare state and the slightly different way that they organize things there, which tends to be more universal, though they have means tested benefits and stuff too. So, but more social spending and more universalistic social spending and on and on. And occasionally someone might recognize, oh, they also have unions and a compressed wage scale. But the thing that they don't want to mention is the very high level of public ownership. You see that most prominently in Norway, of course, and their circumstances are a little unusual with the oil. But even before the oil, they had very high levels of state ownership, and they seem to, for a very long time, kind of have this ethos of public ownership of natural resources. That's probably why when they found the oil, that kind of got folded into that. So, owning all the hydro and other kinds of things. Even now, they're doing stuff to try to capture resource rents from like salmon farmers who use like ocean, like aquaculture, and rents from wind energy. Like they're very, very obsessed with all resource rents should flow into the public, which I mean, that's a Georgist thing, I guess, more than a socialist thing, but
Mm.
it's tended to lead to a lot of public ownership. And then in the other countries, you have other kind of developments. Finland has a very high level of public ownership. The last I checked, is about a third of the national wealth is owned by the government. If you go check to see, well, why is that? What they'll say there, at least the people who write about it, is, Finland was a poor country, a very late developing country. And it was, basically struggled to find international investment. And so the state took on a big role there. And then from there, you don't want to sell off all of your stuff to international investors. You're a kind of marginal open economy. You'd like to maintain national ownership to some extent for strategic reasons. And so they have a lot of state ownership there. Sweden, obviously, in mid-century with the SAP, and then on through the Meidner Plan, where that was going to be sort of the final nail in the coffin, if you will. I mean, they ran up public ownership there from something like 10% of national wealth to almost 50% of national wealth in the middle of last century. It's come down to 25%.
Mm.
And I think they definitely have like everywhere else had their sort of quote unquote neoliberal turn, which mostly took the form of selling off state-owned enterprises and public wealth and stuff like that. But even after they've done all that, they're still top the charts of public ownership. So that's just something I've tried to emphasize because I feel like that's a lot of people there's almost like an incentive for everyone to ignore that, right? The more neoliberally minded people in the US, they like to emphasize it because they want to say, oh, the socialists are wrong. It's just about the welfare state.
Mm.
And then some of the socialists who, they want to emphasize how they like to go above and beyond that. They want to downplay that. And that opens up a great niche to be like, hey guys, there's actually a lot of public ownership here.
Mm.
So we should contend with that in some way.
So what? I mean, you did hint at it in that description, which was really interesting. But like, what purpose do you see state-owned enterprises as solving, right? As serving. So what do they? What can they achieve, right? That maybe a traditional capitalist firm, or maybe even some of those other types of organization like worker or consumer co-ops can't.
Yeah, so I mean, for me, first and foremost, it's always capturing the capital income, and especially trying to spread that out as much as possible.
Mm.
So consumer and worker co-ops, the capital income is captured, but it's not distributed broadly throughout the society. And I think that can be a mistake, right? Because the capital stock. So in a consumer co-op, I guess in theory, you say sort of like the consumers kind of own the capital stock of it. In practice, the consumers might get a dividend in the form of store credit that's related to the amount of money that they spent at the store or something like that. But people who are outside of that, who don't consume from the company, might still have, I'd say they have some reason to have a share of the capital stock, if you will. And the same thing for a worker co-op. So to me, the ideal is ownership administered on the social level, because the ideal is to have capital income spread out throughout the society, whether through dividend or
Mm.
public spending or whatever. But I'm fine with the other forms as well, as certainly better than what we have now. So that's like the first and foremost. The other thing is that state-owned enterprises, it kind of, obviously this is going to be contingent on how well they're run and stuff like that, but they are able to, I think, more cleanly mix social objectives with economic objectives. So in the US, the most obvious example of this is the Postal Service. So the Postal Service has something called the Universal Service Obligation, which basically just means that they got to serve every single address in the US, no matter how far flung it is, and charge
Mm.
reasonable prices. And so like postage is pretty much the same anywhere.
Mm.
And that's a money losing venture,
Yeah.
obviously, when you're reaching out into the hinterlands. But that's able to be organized reasonably well, So for the most part, the profits from the rest of the business cover the losses from the universal service obligation. And you see this actually very well organized, I think, in the Nordic state-owned enterprises, especially in Norway and in Finland, where they have these official structures where each state-owned enterprise, is either identified as having, purely commercial objectives, or as having a mixture of commercial and social objectives. And then the social objective is very well defined, and you're trying
Mm.
to to blend those things together. I think that's hard to do with a private company. You can try to regulate them to achieve certain social objectives, but they're of course always fighting to undermine that. Always seeing how can we maybe skip that address or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it goes to the heart of what your definition of socialism is, right? Which is that if you're defining a private company as having shareholders, right, and obviously that would come with some kind of duty to the shareholders to maximize the returns to them, right? Then that's going to be the overall aim, and any social or environmental or even long-term economic aims are often going to fall by the wayside, right? So I guess that's the gap that state-owned enterprises fill.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think as a governance matter, they're able to mix those a lot better. But obviously, that's not a given, right? The government still needs to care about those other things.
Sure. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, and it is worth saying that a lot of governments don't necessarily, and there's there's plenty of cases of state-owned enterprises um, not working very well, especially when governments aren't accountable. And there are cases of these strategic objectives just not being met, right? When you've had attempts to build industries and industrialize in some poorer countries, and these state-owned enterprises can obviously fail. I think we'd be foolish to pretend that they can't.
Yeah, I mean it's at the end of the day, it's people involved in each of them. But the idea is that as with any governance structure, right, it's a set of kind of decision making methods and stuff like that.
Mm,
And any decision making structure can really kind of reach any decision. But the idea is that on average, they might reach different structures reach different decisions, right? And so on average, the idea is that when you have a state-owned enterprise, because of the way it's governed, it will hopefully, on average, tilt more towards mixing in some of the social objectives where it makes sense to do that. Whereas a private company, it's hard to see how it ever really does that, except I guess maybe if you have a very like philanthropic CEO owner who's just real, kind of idiosyncratic
mm.
and is maybe not, accountable to shareholders because, he owns most of it or something like that.
Yeah, it was the CEO and founder of Patagonia, wasn't it? The clothing and bag
Yeah.
makers who he just I can't did he hasn't the company still exists, but he just gave all of his money away at the end, didn't he?
Yeah, he gave all the shares away to a foundation that works to preserve wild places or something like
Mm.
that.
Mm, yeah, but I mean, that's extremely rare. Even if people go in with that idea, I think by the time they get to the top, right, they're like reluctant to give it up.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, no, he was a true believer in the outdoors, I guess, which
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So I mean, when I'm talking to you now and when I read your stuff, I do get this impression that you're very, very focused on distribution, right? And you're really an advocate of equality and of ending poverty. I was wondering what your kind of rationale for believing in equality is as a socialist, right? Why you think that equality is a an aim that we should pursue?
Yeah, I mean, for me, that is the foundational piece of it. There's different paths into this, but I would say I'm an egalitarian first and foremost, and then socialism seems to be the best path towards that. So I guess in theory, if someone could convince me, that there was another system that would generate even better equality, I might move in that direction. But so far, I haven't seen that. So. Now, why is like equality the main value? Why is that the key value to focus on? And that, I think is a trickier question. It sort of goes to, how do you justify any of your values like at the basic
Mm,
level? It's that's sort of like a meta ethics question, right? So Is it intuition? Is it I don't know. I will say that I guess more than anything, it's kind of a survey of competing approaches, competing values, and trying to see which of those values seem to me to make the most sense. So if you could kind of compare egalitarians to utilitarians, for example. Obviously,
Mm,
there's a lot of overlap there, but the big question there would be something like, does it make sense to you to sacrifice, some extra utils maybe at the top of the distribution in order to get more at the bottom, even if like it's a negative sum, right? Like
yeah.
you're taking 10 units of pleasure from the top in order to give 3 to the bottom. Like, are you willing to do that? And to me, I go, yes, I am willing to do that. I think that makes sense. I think that's important for like inclusiveness in society. Remember, we're all stuck together in this system where we have rules and we
Mm,
need to make rules. And it seems weird to me to say, hey, if you're at the bottom of this system, we're gonna cut you down in order to make someone who's at the top have even more pleasure. It's like stuff like that. It's a sort of the ethical philosophy, moral philosophy, those kinds of almost mind games and puzzles that eventually I was led to think, egalitarianism, the sort of Rawlsian egalitarianism, that kind of thrust makes the most sense to me.
yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I would sacrifice some utility for equality. I mean, one of the other things is, I mean, these are thought experiments, right? So this is why I couldn't be a philosopher, because I do find it hard to get to do these thought experiments. But I think, you know, when you a lot of the consumption and the income of of richer people is very often positional, right? So it's like they only derive utility, because they're doing so much better than other people, right? And one of the things I think is, like, if you compress the income distribution, I'm not 100% sure that they're actually going to lose. They're actually going to lose that much utility, because I'm thinking, well, if everybody is kind of moved down a peg, right, in terms of their level of consumption in dollars, let's say, but they're still kind of in the same. They're still ranked the same, right? I would think that it wouldn't necessarily impact their welfare that badly. I mean, obviously, the exact extent to which that's the case is difficult to determine. But the more I look into it, the more I feel like so much of this consumption is social and positional, and it's just like, actually we can sort of have equality and utility in a lot of cases.
Yeah, no, I think the prescriptions for them mostly overlap just due to what you said, the positional nature of goods that people pursue at the top, and also, of course, diminishing marginal utility. These things, I think, like I don't think you would go to a Norway or a Sweden or something like that and say, oh, well, it satisfies egalitarianism, but not utilitarianism,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
you got to apply, even though their GDPs may be lower, their consumption may be lower overall. If you apply any kind of reasonable discount to the consumption at the top, either due to diminishing marginal utility or due to this sort of status seeking element of it, you're probably going to arrive at the conclusion that they are both. Now, at some margin, maybe they do compete, and that's when the philosophical, rubber hits the road. But
Mm.
where we are now, I don't really see that. And I think the point about status is a very interesting one. There was a book written a while ago called The Darwin Economy. Are you familiar with
Is
that?
that Robert Frank?
I think
I was going
so.
to mention him, so yeah, yeah. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, anyways, he makes a very compelling case, and it's one of those books you read and you're like, wow, this really changes your perspective. And then it's like, oh, no one's really incorporated this at all
Mm.
into their thinking. But yeah, no, you see, one of the things you see where around where I'm at, I live in and around New York City. is at the very top. People are competing, to get into different schools, not colleges, but even like
Mm,
kindergartens and stuff like that. And these schools are very expensive, and it's thinly veiled as we care about education, but the differences they're just non-existent, at that level.
mm,
But it's, every time I go to soccer or whatever to see my kid play, they want to talk to you. They come over, hey, how's that? Oh, yeah, oh yeah, my kid, that one, yeah. Oh, where does she go to school? Yeah.
yeah, yeah. That's an interesting example. I think Frank. I was going to mention him because he's done what I don't know. Maybe I'm too online. I just see everything as a troll. But he does what I consider a troll, which is to say that taxes on the rich are like a tax on an externality. The externality being the consumption of these positional goods, right? So it creates when you consume that's good school that you were just talking about. That creates a cost for everybody else, right? So he says taxes on the rich. There's just internalizing an externality, like the environment, like the standard
Sure.
economic arguments, which I
Well, there's
thought was
also
interesting. Yeah.
there's also a collective action problem to it, right? Which is that if you are in that milieu, and you're at the 95th percentile and you kind of want to be at the 95th percentile, but you don't really even want to you don't want to do all this status seeking stuff. But if you don't, you really are going to fall out of that level. It's all got to happen at once. Like we all got to take a haircut at the same
Mm,
time. We
mm.
all got to take the leap out of this school and into the normal school. And I'm not going to do it alone, but hey, if the government forces my hand, then we can get it done without
Exactly.
us. So
It's also true at the bottom of the income distribution actually as well. I mean, it's something that I've thought because I think say the states is a really good example, right? So take the minimum wage. Now, if you have a minimum wage that's very high in one state and not so high in a neighboring state, it doesn't defy credulity to suppose that businesses might relocate, over time new ones will make the decision. They'll be like, well, we're going to go with the lower minimum wage. But if you've got a federal one that's the same across the country, right, or there's a floor, then suddenly everybody's playing the same game, right? It's a kind of similar collective action problem, and you've got workers who are paid well enough, but because every business has to adjust, right? You don't necessarily have those kind of adverse effects.
yeah, yeah, sure.
Mm.
Yeah, you avoid race to the bottom in the one case, and here a race to the top, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, the race to the bottom and the race to the top. Yeah, I mean, I think you could make a pretty good case against billionaires just purely using the externalities argument. And I'm undecided whether that is a good way to make the argument or if it just speaks to like how loose the externalities concept actually can be. I know you've critiqued it in the past, which is why I mentioned it to you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think sometimes I don't know. Sometimes we reach for arguments that we think will be, this is a cutesy way around it, because it's
Yeah.
not strictly an egalitarian position.
Mm.
You could hold it even if you're not egalitarian, and that's not a bad approach in general, right? Is to uh, 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 pursue like a pluralistic approach to argument that will connect to lots of values, but it can also make you seem, like you're bullshitting a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. If you do it too much, I think. Yeah, I mean, my view. Not to get too sidetracked, but externalities. I think it's one of those where it's not a perfect argument. I do remember your posts, or maybe just one post on this, and I thought it was interesting, saying that it's very difficult to identify what is an externality and what isn't. And if you read economics textbooks, then you do see it defined in a lot of ways, each of which are, some of which are really straightforward, like an effect on the environment, but some of which are a little bit more nebulous, like the effects on employment in a local community. Is that really an externality? I don't know. So it is a bit of a nebulous concept, but it's also the best one that I think I know for making that type of argument about how things, how market transactions and economic transactions basically affect people other than those immediately concerned.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, A lot people reach for that all the time for pretty much everything, and I think that's a telling, the fact that people think that that is the way to go argumentatively probably means that it connects to something, right?
Mm,
And I guess this sort of like liberal kind of value set, right, is we're not supposed to concern ourselves with things that don't concern us. And so the more we can say, hey, that does concern you, that does affect you in some way. Hey, if the schools get worse, then the workforce will be worse, and if workforce will be worse, then your dollars will spend
mm,
more poorly, and then that'll come back to you on the consumption side, and on and on, and all that's true. I mean, the idea. I mean, that's one of the things that I find kind of silly, but about sort of a certain kind of libertarian worldview, right? Is they think things are a lot more isolated than they are,
yeah.
and one easy way to blow up that worldview is just to start drawing all those connections and saying, oh no, actually, this thing where you're saying, oh, these two people are doing what they want, it doesn't affect you. Here's 10 ways in which it does. And
Mm,
you just keep doing that, and then you're like, your whole system doesn't really work, right? Because everything is of concern to everyone on some level. So, I don't, I guess, disagree with that strategy per se, but I do think there's some imprecision in, what counts as an externality and what doesn't.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, I'm so tempted to talk to you about libertarians, but I won't. I'll skip over it
We
because
defeated them. We don't
we,
have to talk about them
yeah.
anymore. They're gone.
They are, aren't they?
They
Yeah,
really are. They
yeah.
disappeared like 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah,
And
they
then
did. Yeah, and yeah, not to blow too much smoke up your ass, but I do think you did quite a good job of vanquishing a lot of their philosophical arguments online, which was the main. I'd never heard of a libertarian before I sort of came online. Right, it's like it's a very online viewpoint, and now it's gone. Although we do now have fascism in its place, so I'm not 100%
yeah,
sure
it's
whether
not an
to thank you,
improvement.
because there are the libertarians at least who are like they want to end the war on drugs and foreign wars and things like that. But yeah, I'm not sure about the new right. I don't think they share those values.
Yeah, no, we've swapped out Ron Paul for Viktor Orban, which
Yeah,
is just
yeah,
not
yeah.
a trade up.
Okay, so I mean, let's talk about the welfare state and redistribution, because that's one plank of yeah. Again, who cares? Who cares whether it's socialism? Let's talk about it.
Sure.
So so I mean, and this does relate to libertarianism actually a little bit. So I remember you saying there's no such thing as redistribution.
Mm.
So could you talk us through that claim a little bit?
Yeah, this was back in the old
Hmm.
libertarian days, but one of the things that you have to contend with when you want to promote social benefits, whatever they may be, whether it's old age pension or child benefit or whatever, is people saying, oh, I don't want you taking my money and spending it on that. I don't want you to take it tax from me and whatever. And, the model that they have in their mind about the economy, the like implicit model that they have is we have, on the one hand, this sort of like market economy that's just kind of running on its own, and it distributes out the income. And then you have the state that comes in, it invades that distribution, this sort of initial distribution, and it starts mucking around with it. And so if that's your view, right, it's like a two-step process. Then you look at the second step and you say, what's going on? You're taking from me and you're giving to someone else. Isn't that theft, et cetera, et cetera? And that's basically where kind of libertarians start and finish their analysis. And what I spent a lot of time doing was making what, I mean, it to me is just a very obvious claim, but which was, I guess, somewhat novel to the online discourse at the time, which was to say, no, 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 no. The income that's distributed in the first place in the market, that is also a part of our governing institutions, right? So the factor payments to labor are affected by hundreds and hundreds of different laws. Of course, I was in law school at the time, whether that's employment laws, discrimination laws, wage and hour laws, the minimum wage. the unions, how they're organized. And you can see this across countries. If you don't have an organized workforce, you get a very dispersed wage distribution. If you have an organized workforce, you get a very compressed wage distribution. All before quote unquote taxes and transfers, right? That's still just the factor payments, and it just depends on how you've set up your labor market institutions. For capital, it's the same kind of thing, whether you're talking about corporate law or property law or bankruptcy law or securities law or on and on down the line, right? All of this is structured by the state. And so it's wrong to think of the welfare state and the tax and transfer system as somehow like uniquely invading the other income distribution when these things are all happening simultaneously, and it's all structured by the same institutions. And also these things might interact, right? You might tolerate a certain kind of institution that helps distribute market income only if there is a tax and transfer institution that moves it around, subsequently. Like those two things might only work if they work together, right? So and we could go on and on, but it's just kind of disentangling that and saying, look, it's all just distribution. It's not redistribution. Taxes are a way of shaping the overall distribution of income in the economy, not a way of taking from one distribution and shifting to another, and so on and so forth. So
yeah, I mean, it's a really powerful argument, and I think the important thing to remember about it is that in itself, it's not actually an argument for what you could contradictorily call redistribution, right? It's not an argument for higher taxes. What it does is it sort of destroys the deontological argument against doing that, right? It destroys the typical libertarian deontological argument against, like, no, you can't do that because that's theft.
Yeah. No, it doesn't make an argument for anything. It just says, hey, you need to descriptively, you need to understand the reality of the economy. And the reality of the economy is it's a big, complex set of institutions. You could go to law school and learn about them. I did it. And
Would you recommend it?
You have to do it to get a credential to be a lawyer. So if you want to be a lawyer, but other than that, no. I mean, I wouldn't recommend going to school to, if you can read and whatever, like you can learn these things on your own. But these systems, it's a whole bundle of institutions that run the economy, and they all interact and they work together, and that's that. Now you need to decide where you want to go with it. Don't set aside a handful of those institutions and say whatever results from those, that's like the real distribution. And then the other institutions refer to those as like invading and stealing from the result of the first one. That's just a conceptual mistake. And libertarians do that because they sort of lazily don't want to argue for their institutions. They don't want to say, hey, these are the institutions that should be set up, no more, no less. They want to just be able to naturalize their institutions into kind of like the baseline reality. Like these are just the natural set of things, the natural order of things. And I'm just opposed to messing with that. And so by flushing it out and saying, oh, okay, so you want the state out of it, so let's just repeal all the property laws then. And you can just, that's fine. Like you'll figure it out. Just repeal the property laws, repeal the contract laws. You can sign pieces of paper and say, I agree, blah, blah, blah. But then what? Then nothing, unless the state is there, right? The contract system is itself set up by the government and so on and so forth. Like by fleshing those out and taking these kind of just sort of things that operate in the background of our economy and putting them on the table and making people realize that no, those are real laws, just like tax laws, and then making them defend them. I think you just put yourself in a better position to make the egalitarian case, but
yeah,
it's not in and of itself generate any kind of conclusion like that.
It is interesting how that vision of the economy, the libertarian vision, and you could in some ways call it the neoclassical vision as well, because sometimes economists kind of, that stuff goes into the background, certainly with the basic theories, but it just doesn't survive any type of contact with reality, any knowledge of the law, any knowledge of history. You look into like how housing tenants rights are defined, and landlords versus renters, and what it means for the landlord to own the home and get money from it and be entitled to money from it, but actually not be allowed into it, at least without a lot of you read through just those regulations and you're like, all they're doing is defining a property right. That's all they're doing, and that takes hundreds and hundreds of pages and so many complicated stipulations and judgment calls that differ across countries and stuff like that. It's like there's nothing natural or inevitable or about it.
Yeah, no, I think yeah, in a way you could even abstract it to say like all of this is just property law, like in a way, right? But they have a very like almost sort of childish notion of property as just kind of being like, well, this is mine and I have full dominion over it, and then on it goes. But the second you even begin to try to look into anything like that, any kind of property arrangement, any transaction or whatever, it's almost, it's just a set of rules. Like
Yeah.
there's really nothing there, and the rules vary reasonably based on the transaction and what you're doing. Property law is like a notoriously difficult class in law school. It's one of the classes you have to take in your first year. And it's just notoriously complicated and sticky. And one of the things that they struggle with, they do eventually get there, but I remember in our class and in our textbook and whatever, is getting people to understand that ownership. So we have a division in like legal cases, and I'm sure it's the same there, between questions of fact and questions of law, right? You got to settle all the facts of the case, and then you apply the law to those facts and generate a conclusion. And one of the big takeaways from this class that they emphasize over and over again is, you guys probably think ownership is a question of fact. It is a question of law. And this is something you just have to hammer people over and over again, because they're like, oh, well, as a factual matter, this belongs to them. They're like, no. Who it belongs to is a consequence of the law. It doesn't precede the law. So we have to look at the rules of the law to make that determination.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. I mean, I've never been to law school, but I've tried to look into this. I mean, you say if you've got a computer and can read, I think one of the sad truths, maybe this is just me, but one of the sad truths of school and having to jump through the hoops to get grades and stuff is that it forces you to to study this stuff. Whereas, like, if you just left me in front of a computer, I have access to all of it, and I do some of it, but I feel like I wouldn't be quite as committed. And especially with law, I mean, it's so difficult to learn about.
Yeah, no, I am. I'm being a little glib about that, but I'm more of an self learner than I think that I'm maybe in the top 1% of self learning tendencies. So.
Yeah. I get that. So that was kind of an abstract introduction, but I wanted to talk to you again, right, about like the practicalities of the welfare state. So, you think we need a welfare state as a matter of necessity, unless you're talking about, obviously people starving, right? And I think this would apply to capitalism, but also like what you see as socialism, right, as well. So could you talk us through why you think that's so important?
Yeah, so this is an area where sometimes I will rub up against certain socialists. But I have what is certainly not a unique to me view, but almost kind of an old-timey view that I've tried to bring back to the fore of the welfare state as being primarily the institution through which we provide resources to people who do not work. I think I have this theory. One day I'm going to nail it down and write a book about it or something. Probably not, but I've poked around on it.
Just to interrupt on the book matter. Is that something you've ever actually properly pursued, or have you had interest on that front?
I have people contact me wanting me to write books frequently, but I really just I have two young children.
I mean, a book is would be like a third child, I think, for the duration. It's a lot. But sorry, anyway, I interrupted you, so please carry on. I was just curious.
Yeah, no, one day,
Mm.
maybe when they're older. But yeah, so is I think since the 70s or 60s, I've even tried to blame it on Michael Harrington, obviously a famous U.S. socialist. His book, I think it was the Two World. I don't even know. It was a, but
Three worlds of welfare capitalism.
oh no, that was Gosta Esping Anderson. He wrote some
Oh
book
right, yeah.
about poverty in the U.S. And he had all
Mm.
these typologies of different kinds of poor people and stuff like that. It's a very gripping book, and
Hmm.
it's largely been credited with the war on poverty and all the anti-poverty stuff that we did in the U.S. for a while there. But there was a an emphasis of the welfare state as eradicating poverty, as focused on poverty, and I think that also tends to focus it on targeted benefits towards the poor. But prior to that, you can find in a lot of countries people writing about the welfare state as just providing income to people who don't work. And the issue is that, people who don't work, they don't have access to money from the market economy unless they own a lot of stuff. But as we mentioned before, very few people own significant amounts of assets. So you have this sort of third class of people that is not typically recognized in our great struggle between capitalists and workers, which are non-workers. And now, of course, workers and non-workers are sort of the same people at different times in their life. But as a matter of distribution, right, you have to get the distribution right every single year. So in a given year, a lot of people are children and they don't work, or they're retired, or they're disabled, or whatever. And yeah, my point is just to say whether you're capitalist or socialist, you have to have some way to get money to those people, especially if you're trying to keep inequality low, but also just to prevent absolute destitution. And an adult who's disabled, they may have no other means to get any kind of income. And I think this can sometimes rub socialists the wrong way because there's alternative view that a lot of socialists subscribe to, which is that the welfare state is this kind of patch onto capitalism that just ameliorates some of the like low pay and exploitation at the bottom of the society. Um, and I think that they're just missing the boat there, right? The welfare state is not primarily for low wage workers. It's primarily for people who don't work at all. And even if you had a socialist society, if in that socialist society you were primarily distributing income through wage payments, even like perfectly equal wage payments,
Hmm.
you'd still have this problem of getting money to people who don't work. So
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really simple but uh, powerful argument, I think, for the welfare state. Because I don't. It seemed there was this strange sort of, well, I don't know if it's strange, but there was the kind of what you might call a worker centric view of it, I think, where it's like you said, it's just sort of about people who are maybe temporarily out of work, and maybe redistribution in general, but you simply cannot escape that a lot, most of it. I mean, I think it's around, very loosely, it's like 50-50, isn't it, usually, in terms of
yeah,
population, right?
right now in
About,
like developed world, yeah.
yeah, in rich countries, right? It's like about half the population just aren't working, and they're not going to work, right? They're either too old or too young, or they're engaging in other activities, like child rearing, for instance, which has mostly been women. And if you have to address those inequalities, and, well, not just inequality, but outright poverty, if you didn't have that welfare state, it's just a basic fact in modern society, in modern economies, that is the mechanism we have to deal with the fact that half of people don't work, right? And I mean, you might try and think of another one, a more communist one, but I haven't seen one that manages to do it at such a scale.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean, you could imagine getting rid of wages, I guess on some level, and then now everyone just gets a pay, and then you're like, hey, there's no welfare state, I mean, you could still
Mm.
conceptually back out the welfare state there and be like, well, wait a minute, this guy, he works, and yeah, he doesn't get a wage, but we could imagine what his wage might be, and he's getting less than that, and we could imagine that as a tax or whatever. But But in all sort of practicality, right? We're gonna want to have a program for the old, for the disabled, for the unemployed, for children, and a number of programs. It doesn't always have to be cash necessarily, right? For kids, you have childcare benefits and
Mm,
school, and for elderly and disabled people, you have social care and stuff like that.
mm,
So, but they got to have some way to do it. And the other part of that piece is not just that some people don't work, it's that because some people might say, well, hey, yeah, maybe kids don't work, but they live with parents who work. The other piece of that puzzle is that the people who don't work, the 50% of people who don't work, they're not evenly distributed across households. If that were the case, then
right.
okay, cool. We've got a 50-50 mix in each household, either one worker and one non-worker, or two workers and two non-workers. And then maybe it's all well and good. The factor payments to the workers will spread to the non-workers because they live in a family together. But that's just not how it works, right? A pensioner couple has two non-workers and zero workers in it.
Mm,
If a single mother with three kids, we got one worker and three non-workers in it, and
mm,
and on, right? So you're gonna have massive inequality, even if you had equality in every other facet of society, like every wage worker was paid the exact same wage, you would still have massive inequality between families just because the distribution of non-workers is not equal across families. So.
yeah. So I mean, what do you think? You've written quite a bit about some of the Biden administration's policies, which have, at least at one point, seemed to be making motions towards an expanded welfare state, especially in, I mean, notwithstanding COVID, but especially in childcare. So, how do you feel about those? Do you think they're move steps in the right direction? Do you think they're going to be sustained?
Yeah, I mean, we had the when he got in, we had the sort of stimulus bill, sort of a 3.0, because Trump did two of them, and then Biden did a third one, and it was very similar to the Trump one, but different in certain important respects, including that for 1 year they were going to have a monthly child benefit that actually went to poor children. We have an annual child benefit in the U.S., but it is phased in, meaning that if your income is below a certain level, you are not eligible for it, which seems very paradoxical. But the idea is that that's supposed to encourage people to work. And so if mom and dad don't respond to that incentive, then you go hungry. But even more incentive for
Yeah.
them, I guess, to work, because that's very motivating when your kid's hungry, I suppose. But and he genuinely wanted to make that a permanent thing, and it just didn't make it through because Joe Manchin, the sort of the center of the Senate right now, the swing vote, if you will, he didn't like it. He thought that this has been reported that he thought that poor people were going to use it on drugs, and so they nixed that.
Mm,
And then they were trying this other bill called the Build Back Better bill that included a lot of welfare state stuff. It was going to include, and I don't know, we can get into the details of each of these things, so it's kind of irrelevant now that it didn't pass. But there was money for childcare and pre-K and parental and paid leave. The child tax credit thing was in there as well. And a number of other, but more money for social care and Medicaid and so
mm,
on and so forth. That all got killed. The only thing we wound up with in a permanent way for the welfare state under Biden, and that's not going to change in his first term because Republicans now control the House, was in our healthcare system. If you are an individual who needs insurance, but you're not poor enough to get Medicaid, which is the poor people program, you have to go buy health insurance on an individual exchange using a sliding scale subsidy. But they had a cliff where if you made more than 400% of the federal poverty line, your personal income was over that, you now had to pay the full premium for the health insurance instead of like a
mm,
sliding scale. So like making an extra dollar could cost you, I mean, tens of thousands of dollars
right.
potentially. And they fixed that. So now it's a more of a smooth scale all the way up. But that literally affects like 2 or 3 million people out of 330 million in the country. They did that. They changed some of the prescription drug stuff for Medicare, which is the program for elderly and disabled people to get health
Yeah.
care. That's it. That's all that really made it through. So.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't really want to get into the U.S. political system. I'll just be very depressed. But I was just thinking. I mean, it came up at least twice in what you were saying, and I wanted to talk to you about it. A big issue, I think, for the modern social democratic or democratic socialist movement is means testing. That's become something that's really our enemy, I think, means testing, right? So you were talking about it with the subsidies, right? But also it came up with the healthcare, right? And it's these means tests, and it's all it all sounds good, I think, because basically what people will say to you is they're like, well, do you want the rich to receive these benefits? And the intuitive answer for that in my head still now is still like kind of no. Well, I do see where you're coming from, right? But then what you end up with is this horrible mess of a whole load of different means tests, many of which don't really work as intended or aren't particularly well designed. But even if they did, it just creates some very odd incentives, right? And basically ends up excluding people who need it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and anytime you try to exclude, like I think, and I've tried to emphasize this more recently, is like focus first and foremost, not on this abstract question, but on what practically does this look like when you administer it, right? Think about it. We have
Mm,
a welfare office, we have people who work in it, there are forms, there's like a system here. What are you saying should be done to make this happen? And so if you want to use an income test, and say, hey, people over a certain income shouldn't get it. That sounds great. But now ask yourself, how are we going to determine who is above that income and who is below it? And what's going to happen when we try to do that, right? For one, if you're using quote unquote current income, actually figuring out what someone's current income is not really all that straightforward. For some people it is, but you have a lot of cases where it's not, right? So for example, if you're a self-employed person who has lumpy income, which this is true of gig workers as well, who are technically self-employed under our laws at least, um, their income is not stable. So what does it mean to say what their monthly income is? Or are we doing a look back for 12 months and saying, oh, what did you make over the last 12 months? We're going to try to do that. So we need everyone to submit 12 months of pay stubs. But what if, okay, yeah, in the prior 12 months, things were going great or okay, but it's like it's just been in the last couple months that things have just bottomed out and now they're desperate. So what do we do
mm,
with those people? Like actually figuring out what someone's current income is not particularly easy. And and even if it were, people got to file all these forms, they got to submit all these pay stubs, they got to try to get information from their employer who may not be interested in cooperating with them. So while you're trying to keep someone who, makes over $100,000 from claiming the benefit, you're creating these burdens that people who are at the bottom, like a large minority of them, can't satisfy.
mm,
They just can't do it. So you're pushing them out of the program in an effort to push rich people out of the program. Um, and then the other and that well, and I mean the cherry on top is you're like, okay, yeah, but I still don't want to give it to the rich. And you say, well, we have a way to drain the incomes of rich people already, right? We have a tax system that's
mm,
capable of doing that. So whatever you're concerned about with the net distributive impact of providing this benefit to everyone, for example, like a universal child benefit, you can just, move up the tax rate, right? So instead of phasing the benefit out at 5 cents for every dollar earned beyond 100 grand, just bump the tax rate over there a
mm,
little bit. And now the benefit administrator doesn't have to worry about it. And people don't have to file all this information about their income to try to get the benefit. The benefit just flows to everyone. And then we use the tax system, which is really good at adjusting incomes.
mm,
And it has the benefit of being applied annually using retroactive information and not having to try to guess. And if you've ever seen these systems up close, I mean, it's really quite crazy watching them try to figure out like what someone's income is going to be for the year or something like that. For the one I was telling you before about the exchange healthcare plans that you get as an individual, you have to predict what your income is going to be for the year. So
Yeah.
you have to say annually, I think this year I'm going to make this much, and that determines how much subsidy you get. But if you're wrong, then you might have to pay back. And it's like these people, like the whole notion of buying health insurance on the individual exchange, it means that you're not on Medicaid. You're not like in a normal employer situation, because if you were, you'd be getting it from your employer probably. You're in some kind of unstable individual employment doing odd jobs or something like that. And we want you to tell us what your income for the year is going to be. It's just, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, no, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And the thing is, right? It's like with taxation, it it cuts across the entire system, right? It's like the total, right? The total distribution, whereas each benefits program, is or benefits broadly defined is administered individually, right? So it's like you can't guarantee that what you're doing actually has a progressive impact overall. And then once you put them all together, then you're even less guaranteed, and they maybe interact in weird ways.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, like each means test is its own tax system. And so
Yeah,
if you've got like 10 benefits that all have different means tests, then on top of your normal tax system, which is like a means test for factor payments,
yeah.
right? We have a means test for or I guess sometimes they might apply the tax to benefits as well. But on top of that means test, you've got 10 other ones. So you've got 10 parallel tax systems
Mm.
working. They use different income definitions. I mean, I guess you could fix that, but um, you don't need 10 different tax authorities trying to plug through all of this income information. Especially, and I mean, again, I guess maybe you could streamline this to some extent, but for the US benefits that use the means test, like each office wants you to submit this information separately. Like it's not as if you go to them and they go, okay, cool, we'll pull your record up from the computer and it tells us, what you're making because it's been reported to this. No,
Mm.
so you're basically filing a tax return for every benefit that you're trying to get. And each of these agencies is dealing with the complications of trying to figure out what your income is for purposes of applying the means test tax. Like one funny like kind of anecdote about this is I think it was in 20 like a few years ago, Jeff Bezos, we know this because his tax returns were leaked recently. He got the child tax credit, which is only meant to be for people with income below, I think at the time it was like $90,000 a year. He got three child tax credits for his kid because, just the way his income worked out with capital losses, like Amazon stock was down or something like that. He was able to his taxable income was reported at like $30,000 or something. Which I mean, if it had been reported at zero, he wouldn't have been eligible. And if it had been, reported over, but because it was reported at $30,000, he got $6,000 worth of child tax credits. And it's like, well, yeah, so what do you want to do about that? Like, obviously, this man is not intended to get, like, in the spirit of things,
Mm.
to get these kinds of benefits, right? It was like the wealthiest man in the world. Um, but what? So we're gonna add an asset test to it? So what, we're gonna have everyone report their assets like like I don't know. Yeah, we can't do it. So it makes sense just to give it to them. But in that case, just give it to everyone,
Mm.
and then we
Yeah.
can work out the rest through the tax code. So
Yeah, and it reduces administrative like burden as well, like as you've described. I think there's also something. I mean, I'm probably not the best at expressing this. I'm not very good at sociology or politics, but there's something about having a suite of universal benefits, including maybe UBI, but also schools and everything else, that are just free at the point of use for everybody, within a society, and that you are a member of that society, you're entitled to those benefits, and in that sense, although there would still be inequality, everyone is treated equally by that system, right? And it doesn't matter who you are, how poor or rich you are, right? I think there's something to be said for that.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, I mean, I think it just makes for a neat, arrangement. It's very simple. But then there are aside from the technical aspects of administration, there's also the question of inequality, and this goes back to how you view the welfare state,
Mm,
whether you're viewing it as meaning primarily to help poor people or primarily to provide income to non-workers, right? So, Jeff Bezos has a lot of money. Don't get me wrong, and I'm sure his kids are fine, but his kids do not work. They
mm,
don't receive income from the market, so they should get some income.
mm.
Just as if he had a disabled wife in our system, she would receive a disability benefit
Yeah.
regardless of his income. And the same for unemployment. And I know different countries do it differently. But here, if you become unemployed, and your spouse makes $1 million a year, you still receive unemployment benefits
Mm,
because, you're unemployed, you lost your job, and here's your money. So if you view it as in that way, then you don't really have a problem with giving because you're not giving money you're giving money to non-workers who happen to live with people who are
mm,
rich.
mm,
Um, and you also want to create what they call horizontal equality at every level of the system, right? So if you have, let's say, a married couple, they both make good money, so they're making, I don't know, let's say 150 grand or something together. And they have no kids. And then you got beside them the same couple, same jobs, 150 grand, and they have 3 kids. Those people are living very different lives financially, even though the two parents work and are identical, right? And so we would like to have a cross transfer between those two people, it seems to me, right? To create equality between those two family units. And the
mm,
only way to create equality between those two family units is to adjust their income in a way that accounts for the fact that one of them is caring for 3 kids and one of them is not. And
mm.
that's going to require a universal benefit with the kids getting free school and a check each month and whatever. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a really good way of putting it. It's I mean, and it's I guess you kind of said this, but another way of putting it is like it's redistribution within the family unit as well. Like even within Jeff Bezos's house, right? It's like, okay, he earns loads of money, and yeah, of course he uses it to take care of his family. Of course he does. But like, still, what we're saying is there's this, we tax him and give it to his wife and kids as well, right? If they're not earning. That's a bit of a sexist assumption on my part that she wasn't, but let's just say the kids weren't earning, right?
yeah,
We're still having that redistribution, right? It's still necessary. It's still a part of the welfare state, as we discussed earlier.
sure, yeah. And I mean that's especially true when you're dealing with other adults in the household. Obviously, kids are you're going to be the custodian of the funds that come in for them anyways. But
Yeah, true.
if you have a disabled spouse or an unemployed spouse or a spouse who's taking care of kids, the fact that I mean, people have made this point forever, though the solution has often been to try to get them into work, which is fine to some extent. But if you're the only one who all the money coming in is in your name and potentially in your bank account, that's not great for the spouse, and we'd
No,
like the spouse to have their own source of money. So
no. I mean, yeah. In terms of sort of the liberation of women, I think like guaranteed access to like income would be absolutely invaluable, right? I think that's a really important thing that has been a reason that women have had to stay with the husbands who either at the worst end they're absolutely abusive and horrible, but then at the sort of quote unquote best end maybe they just don't really want to stay with them, but they do for financial reasons, right? So I think it's kind of a UBI strikes me as a policy that should be seen as feminist to some degree.
yeah, yeah, no, I know people go back and forth on that, but because people will say, hey, well, that will, and it depends, I guess, on the degree to which you think the labor market is the be all end all of personal liberation or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
I'm obviously more skeptical of that, but some people will say, hey, if you provide whether it's a home child care benefit or a basic income or something like that, that would ensure that home carers, which are overwhelmingly women,
Mm.
that they're taken care of in that situation, have their own income or whatever. They'll say, well, that's gonna reduce their incentive to take up work, and it's in the marketplace. It's in the labor market where they have the real ultimate freedom and
Mm.
equality.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
I've run into that from time to time arguing
Interesting.
this in the U.S. And it's an intra-feminist debate. Obviously we've
Yeah.
had wages for housework and stuff like that. Like there's a long chain. I would say primarily the majority view, I would say historically among feminists has been focused on let's get cash specifically to women, especially home carers and stuff like that, in order to provide some distance and independence. But you do now have people who say, oh, no, 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 no. The best way to get independence and distance is to get them in the labor market, and
Mm.
we kind of got to nudge them into the labor market, the
I th-
same way that making the kids hungry,
yeah.
nudges them in
Yeah.
the labor market. So
Yeah. I think the anti-capitalist feminists are very against that sort of, well, not against the entry of women into the labour force, but they definitely view it as limited, right? Because they're just saying, well, you're just, now women are just part of the capitalist machine as well, right? Like it's like, yeah,
yeah, no, the more kind of radical leftist anti-capitalist socialist feminists are much more often in favor of those kinds of in direct cash to home carers or whatever. And I think it's more when you get on the kind of more moderate liberal feminists where you get a little bit more wishy-washiness, because it's not just, hey, well, you go in the system, but one of the points some of the more feminist advocates of more like socialist feminist angle of this would be like, oh, okay, so you want to trade the boss at home with another, you want another man to tell you what to do all day. Okay, cool.
yeah,
And not a it's not
yeah,
fair for women to be harassed in the workplace
oh,
and whatever,
yeah.
so
I've also heard a critique, which is, yeah, it's kind of convincing, that one, and it's also like, there's that critique where it's like, okay, we've got like, uh, you know, women go to work and we've got like state-funded childcare, but like, oh, who's working in the state-funded childcare? Well, it's women,
yeah.
right? And it's like, yeah, I mean, it's not the economics can't solely sort of fix, sexism and so on. Like there's, yeah, it's always going to be it's always going to be, yeah, I don't know, those tendencies are going to be reinforced by, I think, even a socialist economic system. I don't think if we had socialism as you're describing it tomorrow, then obviously I don't think, to be clear to everyone, like sexism would disappear or anything like that. That's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, no, no. Yeah, no, if your objection, if your reason for nudging people in the workforce instead of providing, say, like a home caregiver benefit or whatever, is, well, we want to change the gender distribution of labor. We don't want it to be that, you know, taking care of kids is a women's thing. And like I agree with
Mm,
that. Like
sure.
we should want to change that. But as we've seen in the countries that have been most successful at getting kids into childcare, it is literally like 95% female workforce.
Yeah.
So yeah, you change the household dynamics, which may be useful, though maybe not, just depending on the situation. Maybe a home caregiver allowance would have also changed the dynamics in a way that achieves that goal.
Mm,
But you didn't really change the gender distribution of
yeah.
childcare work.
Yeah.
And I don't know, you know, I a lot of there have been attempts to do it, and I have no idea how you do that. Like
No.
how do you change the gendered self-selection into different sectors? That's a tough one.
I think these are, yeah, these are very deep seated kind of social norms, aren't they? That it just, yeah, it's not easy or quick to change. I want to ask you about something else which is a bit controversial. So I'm trying to get you into as much trouble as possible. So, what's your opinion on the MMT view that taxes don't fund spending? Now, this is something that you see a lot, right? People say, look, taxes don't actually fund spending. Spending comes prior to taxes. The government spends, then they tax it back. The government can just create money through whatever means to fund its obligations. The real limit, which is inflation, and that tells us whether we're at full employment of resources, right? So MMTs would tend not to emphasize taxes as a way to fund the public spending that maybe you're advocating. Do you agree with them? I think both. I think there's two questions, right? Because it's like, do you agree with them on a technical level, and then do you agree with them on a kind of political or rhetorical level?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on Twitter, though less time writing because I've tried to just be like, this is not worth writing about. But occasionally I have written about it. And what I can tell from what they say, to me, they really like to engage in some semantical games. I think they a lot of times like to use kind of shocking language that when you unpeel it, is actually saying something quite banal. And that is a good example of it. So when they say something like taxes don't fund spending, immediately, your mind goes to, well, wait a minute. We have this thing called the treasury, and they tax, and the money comes in, and then from that same account, or whatever, right, the money is spent. And that's not the only way, of course, right? So you take a step back and you say there are other ways that the government finances spending, right? You can use tax money, you can borrow, right? Sell bonds, get money in that way. You could sell assets, get money in that way to spend. Or you could also do seigniorage,
Mm,
which is money creation that
mm,
governments do. And one of the things I've always found very interesting about MMT stuff is they don't use the word seigniorage. This is maybe kooky on my end, but in my mind, that it just very suspicious to me because like we have a word for the thing you're talking about that's been around for like hundreds of years, seigniorage,
mm.
and you don't use it, and you make it sound like you're saying something new here. But yeah, the government can create money. They create coins back in the old days, right? They would
Yeah.
create coins and they could spin those in, and like the difference between the cost of the coin and whatever the face value of it was, that would essentially be sort of free money, if you will, to the state. Now we don't even have to create coins, right? Because it's electronic, so it's like 100% profitable, if you will, to make more money. But yeah, so that to my mind, that's how you usually would think about it in a sort of economically minded way, is that, the government uses taxes, borrowing, and seigniorage to fund spending. What they do is they go, actually, that taxes and borrowing bit, that's really kind of like anti-seigniorage. So like you could reconceptualize it where all spending is seigniorage. And then the taxes and the borrowing, that's just bringing money in and then holding on to it. So instead of bringing money in and then spending it out, all the money that comes in, we just hold on to it or destroy it, I guess. And then all the money that comes out, we'll just call that seigniorage.
Mm.
And you go, okay, I mean, you could conceptually do that. I don't know if like from a matter of like accounts, like if you were to track money through the system, whether that's like quite what they're doing. But conceptually, I get it. Sure, all the money spent out, seigniorage. All the money comes in, anti-seigniorage.
Mm.
And then you go, okay, so what does that do for us? What is that rejiggering of our thought process? What does that do for us? And they go, well, what that means is when the economy is operating under capacity, you can do more seigniorage than you do anti-seigniorage, right? You can spend more than you tax or spend more than you borrow. You can print money. And the net effect of that will be stimulation,
Mm.
more hiring, the expansion of GDP will sort of absorb that. And then you say, okay, yeah, sure. I thought I learned that in like Keynesian 101, like in my macro course in high school that I took. I'm pretty sure I learned that already. So what's like what's the novelty here? Because you acknowledge that once we hit capacity, if you keep running the seniorage and without amping up the anti-senior, we're going to get inflation, right? So
Mm.
what you're telling me is that we can engage in monetary and fiscal stimulus on a countercyclical basis. That's what you're telling me. But I had to spend 5 hours figuring out that that's what you're telling me. And that's very strange because that's also I thought that was a basic view. I thought that was pretty standard Keynesian, like would most I thought most economists would agree with
Mm.
that, wouldn't they? So that's kind of what I think about that, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I was. It's a shame you can't see me. It doesn't let you send the camera to two different programs, but I was kind of like stifling a laugh then, because I know how annoyed MMT would be at that. But yeah, I mean, look, I mean, you've got economists and you've got economists. You've got I don't know, the sort of real business cycle theorists who obviously would be like vehemently anti-seniorage, right? But no, I mean, in terms of Keynesian economics and you know, a lot of post-Keynesian economists, I think we've always sort of had that view. I guess one of the successes of MMT for me, to partially defend it, because I don't really disagree with you on what you've just said technically, is like getting these issues to the forefront. I feel like they've been quite effective at doing that, and I feel like that's quite a good thing. Maybe just because they have that striking language. I don't know what it is, or just because of their commitment, you know, their zealotry, and I don't use that word in a necessarily negative term, right?
Yeah, no, I think from a sales perspective, it's because this topic is so boring, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it's the number of people that they were able to get interested in it
Mm,
far exceeds, I think, what anyone who was interested in whether Keynesian or post-Keynesian or monetary stimulus, or like most people couldn't even begin. And they were able to hit a lot, bring in activists and stuff, and make it intriguing enough to them to get them interested in it. Now,
mm,
I think that kind of goes both ways, right? So on the one hand, I think one of the ways they did that was using like the provocative language, and also presenting it as like a new thing, right? Because it's new, it's provocative, and whatever. And yeah, when you unfold it, you go, that's just kind of a new rhetorical way to say something a lot of people have been saying for a while. Um, but whatever, right? It got those people in. But the other way I think it got people in that I think is a little bit not helpful is they were less they were very interested in telling you how we could do countercyclical monetary and fiscal stimulus, right?
mm,
They were less interested in making sure that people didn't run with that to think that you could always use seniorage to fund anything and like it wouldn't be a problem. Now, in their papers, of course, they'll tell you, no, of course, obviously, we would eventually run into inflation and you'd have to use taxes and whatever. But online, you saw a lot of, you know, consumers of that stuff taking away from it the idea that, yeah, you just like we could go up to Nordic levels of welfare spending, of social spending, just through seniorage on a permanent basis, and it
sure.
would be no problem. Like that's not true. That's not even really what they're saying. But I feel like they're kind of fanning the flames to make you think that because
Yeah.
you're interested.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, yeah, you put it really well, right? So you've got, yeah, the political effectiveness, but then with political effectiveness comes that kind of those misinterpretations, right? And the more dangerous ideas, I think, that don't really make sense, right? Because MMT, you
Sure.
know, all the leading MMTers, I don't know, Stephanie Kelton, Randall Ray, Nathan Tankus as well, right? Like these people, you know, they understand what you just everything you just said perfectly. But then I think there's a lot of that, yeah, that kind of we can just sort of do what we want with, you know, cutting taxes and raising spending, and there's no real need for worrying about, you know, whether the budget balances in some kind of broad sense. I don't mean exactly equivalent, but you know, I mean over the long term, is there some kind of correspondence, right, between taxes and revenues? But it's like, well, if you think of it in terms of real resources, which MMTs do, if you have a high tax, high spend economy, right, a socialist economy like the the Nordic economies, or a social democratic economy, lots of benefits, lots of government run enterprises, including some loss making ones, you're shifting from private towards public economic activity, right? And that for me, that's what taxes do. It's right, like we're taking this money from the private sector on net. I know public employees are taxed too, but on net, right? And we're taking those resources and we're shifting them away into the public sector, right? So that accounting, while it's imperfect, right, and technically taxes may not fund revenues if you go into like the accounts of the Treasury, I don't know, but like it's a proxy for how much of the economy is public and how much is private, and we want to move as socialists, MMTs, post Keynesians, whatever, towards a more public economy.
Sure, yeah. No, I mean, and if the constraint is inflation, well, the way to keep that constraint as far out as possible is to have as high a tax as possible, right? Like we want to create as much space for non-inflationary spending as possible
Mm.
because the public spending is the socially directed spending, which we like. And the way to create the most space for that is going to be through the highest taxes, right?
Mm.
So, you know, and if you're really kind of selling this bill of goods that we don't need higher taxes, we don't need higher taxes, we don't need higher taxes. I mean, part of the problem you're going to run into is you're going to hit that wall much more quickly. And you're also just going to end up being discredited. I mean, I think part of what happened, I don't know, to my mind, I guess it's hard to judge these things. MMT, it's kind of gone the way of libertarianism a little bit. Like it's kind of in the rearview mirror. People aren't really talking about it as much as they used
Mm.
to.
Mm.
And I have to imagine part of that is, the inflation that we've seen and the
Yeah.
idea, yeah. I mean, and who knows if that, how much of that is because of COVID stimulus, how much of it is because of supply shocks and whatever. People can argue forever about that, but whatever is the proximate cause, it's hard to imagine that in this environment, more seniorage is not going to just juice inflation. So.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there's this question of like what it goes towards, right? But I think in the short term, absolutely. I mean, there's this idea of supply side progressivism that I've become a bit more enamored with over the past few years. But like expanding the productive capacity in various means, whether that's supply chains or I mean, people talk about the child. Like the CARES Act and things as one way of doing that as well, don't they? But I don't think. I mean, just sort of stimulus spending at this stage, I wouldn't advocate it. I think it is inflationary.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I suppose you could make targeted investments or
Yeah.
whatever. Of course, those take time, and so.
Yeah, they're not going to have an immediate impact, and the immediate impact might actually still be inflationary. So I mean, it's a difficult sell, but yeah. Let's talk about another MMT policy. Maybe it might be the last thing we talk about before we finish. But because we're on MMT, they really like job guarantees, right? And sort of coincidentally, I watched a debate you had. Was it at the DSA? It was a while ago. It was
Yeah,
a
with
couple of
Mark
years.
Paul.
That's right. Yeah, about the job guarantee. So you're not a massive fan of the job guarantee. Could you explain why?
Yeah, as a kind of welfare first sort of person, when I first heard about the job guarantee, um, I looked at it and I was like, well, I know a lot about welfare systems. I've done a lot of cross-country welfare stuff. And this is normally called the workfare approach to unemployment, which, the left is usually not a fan of because they view it as kind of harassing benefit recipients and also as a way to kind of push people off the rolls and stuff like that because they don't meet their work requirements. My mind went to work for the Dole in Australia, which is a program that always sticks in my mind just because the name is so wild. And I was like, this is bad, like I know it sounds cool, job guarantee, but it's an unemployment benefit where you have to meet certain work activity requirements in order to receive the money. And this was obviously met with very fierce reactions, and still to this day, I suppose. But I've yet to be find any convincing counter argument for how that's not the case. And in fact, the more I've read, the more I actually started to read stuff that Randy Ray wrote, stuff that Bill Mitchell wrote, stuff that oh geez, what's the big guy? Minsky. They are very clear that that's what they have in mind. And, okay, that was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The new people aren't like that. Of course, Ray and Mitchell are still around. But, you know, that just made me even more certain, like, oh, wait, this 1994 paper from Ray, literally, that's literally what he's describing. And he's very clear and unashamed about it. And Minsky, oh my God, Minsky was saying, like, we need to pull kids out of high school and pull elderly people out of their old age pension, or condition like half of their old age pension on them doing like community service work and stuff like that. Like these are folks who just really they like work requirements for welfare benefits. Like that's a thing,
I
you
mean, I
know?
think, yeah, it's interesting. I think the assumption that these people are or were progressive in the modern sense of the term is very dangerous, and I don't think they necessarily were. Like, just because economics. People assume that your economic school of thought aligns with your politics, and often that is the case, right? Like, if you're a heterodox economist, you're probably a bit more lefty. If you're an Austrian economist, then you're probably uber right wing. But like, it doesn't necessarily. And you get like, I mean, even Keynes, right? He's sort of at the time he was kind of framing his proposals as small c conservative, and like, so it's not that shocking that somebody with the MMT view could actually be small c conservative and have these views about work requirements and want like to use MMT to lower taxes, for instance, instead of increase spending. It's entirely possible, and indeed
Yeah.
it's true.
No, I don't see there's no contradiction between
Mm,
the two of them at all. I mean, as they'll tell you, the MMT, to the extent that it's primarily about how you can use seniorage, that doesn't tell us we should or how much we should.
mm,
It doesn't tell us how much how big the welfare state ought to be. It doesn't do any of that, right? It's just an acknowledgement of the ability to do countercyclical stimulus, and I would say an endorsement of the idea of doing counter cyclical stimulus. But that's a small thing. That's not okay. Well, should we also have like what should old age pension look like? What should disability benefits look like? What should
yeah.
unemployment benefits? It's got nothing to do with any of that. Now, one thing that I have found a little bit suspicious and weird is they are disconnected from one another, but why then why do they everyone like adopt both of them, and I mean that goes to the social dynamics of movements, I'm sure,
Mm,
but
mm.
I've always found that really strange. It's like everyone who they hear taxes don't fund spending and they kind of their eyes light up and go down the rabbit hole, they also end up at the end being like, it's really key that our unemployment benefit, that people have to do community service in order to get
Yeah.
it. I'm like,
Yeah,
what?
it doesn't follow at all. I really don't understand that. I agree with you, and I mean, it's just, it's just UBI with a work requirement, right? I mean, in that sense, it's not UBI, but right, it's just like you're giving them money, but now
See,
you're saying, oh, they've got to work as well.
See, I think that's actually a little bit off, and I think that's part of the again one of those things where it's like it's a little bit strange because they position it as the alternative to UBI,
Hmm.
and I look at it and I'm like, guys, this is the alternative to unemployment benefits as we know it, right? Because that's what you're talking about people who don't have a normal job. And we
Hmm.
have a program for that where we give them money. You also want to give them money, right? You also want to give people who don't have a normal job money. It's just that you want to make them do stuff for it.
Hmm.
And that's, I don't know. I guess I can get the impulse for it to some extent, but it's just that's I don't agree with that. And I also think again, when we get to practical administration, when you make these benefits hard to claim, that doesn't work out very well. Like I think, and this
Yeah.
is especially true for unemployment. I was unemployed on benefits for 3 or 4 months.
Hmm.
And, I'm looking for a job. I'm in a bit of an oddball situation where I got fired in a public way. And so
Mm.
there's like stuff about me on the internet. And I have a specific set of skills that are somewhat niche. I'm trying to be a labor lawyer. I've got like a tricky path ahead of me, to navigate the labor market and get back in, ideally to get back in a job that is, you know, at my same earnings level, at my same skill level and
You have
whatever.
posting on your CV.
Yeah, that was, and if I had to I mean, and these people, they wanted you to work a full-time job. If I had to get up and spend even 20 hours a week doing community service, I want to be job seeking. I
Yeah.
want to be trying to talk to people, I had to do these soft touch things with the unions. Hey, yeah, I know, but let me talk to you. Yeah. And you want me to go do 20 hours of raking leaves. And I don't mean to diminish that activity, but that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to
Mm.
get back in the labor market in a normal way. And what you're asking of me would make that harder. So I don't want it.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's like, I think one of the issues is, and people often make this mistake, I think. I mean, this is where libertarians actually, to come sort of full circle, sometimes have a point, is their skepticism of state involvement in certain things, right? And I think it's okay to think that raking leaves is a necessary thing that we should have more of. People should do more community work. We don't take care of our neighborhoods as much as we could do. We don't take care of the environment as much as we could do, etc. Those types of jobs, volunteering jobs, socially useful jobs. We need more of those, probably, right? But to then like say that's something that the state should mandate through benefits, right, as a means test attached to benefits, is actually an entirely different claim, because you're not saying raking leaves is bad. You're just saying that you shouldn't make people do it in order to get access to money that they need to live.
Yes, right. And
Yeah.
especially to get unemployment benefits. And these things can be detached, right? So
Mm.
I would have no problem if you want to put some money aside to have the government essentially coordinate community service activities, because there are a lot of people, and you see this especially among elderly, retired people. They're still like physically robust and they get bored and alienated sometimes. And if you wanted to make it real easy for them to just like go to some kind of government clearinghouse and hey, we've got all these volunteer activities and whatever. Cool. Don't condition
Mm.
their old age pension on it though. Like if they want to do it, they'll do it. And a lot of people do try to volunteer like that. I have no issue with that.
Mm.
And if you have something that you're like, well, look, I don't want to leave this strictly to volunteering, then just fund it in a normal way, right? One of the things they always would focus on, there were a lot of kind of community service projects related to parks and stuff, raking and painting and like just public. And it's like, well, look, every city in our country has a parks and rec department. Just
Mm.
up their budget and tell them
Yeah.
to go hire someone. Here you go. You got one more job there, and someone got it, and through some vacancy chain, we have one less unemployed person. So you kind of solve the same thing.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, you sort of touched on this, but with the job guarantee, one of the claims is that it will reduce or anchor inflation, right? By having a kind of set floor under wages, so that there's no kind of wage price spiral. I mean, what do you think of that claim?
Yeah, so it's important to understand what they're advocating there because sometimes they shroud that in very complicated language as well. But what they're saying there is that if in a wage price spiral, right, the labor market is too tight, right, and so we have too many, too many employers chasing too few workers,
Mm-hmm.
and then the workers just escalate their wages, and then that finds itself into prices and inflation. It becomes very unstable, right? And so, the way that we deal with this right now in theory, though we haven't had this problem for quite a while, is we cool down the macro economy in order to reduce demand for labor and cause people to be laid off, probably, right? I guess there's technically a way to do it perfectly where you don't, but if you overshoot, or it's already too hot and you feel like you need to overshoot, you're going to have millions of people thrown out of work, right? And right now, and in a good system, those millions of workers would hopefully be put on benefits, and they will go back to work. And it's important to understand that when people
Sure.
become unemployed, like unemployment, it's a revolving door, right? So they go back into work in a few months, someone else will be unemployed. And okay, so that's the system we have right now, and that it cools down the wage price spiral. So their alternative is the same thing, except when those workers get laid off and put on benefits, one, their benefit is tied to the minimum wage. So
Hmm.
it's not earnings related. So it's not like replacing a certain fraction of your income. That's bad, in my view, like in terms of income security. And then two, you got to go do community service.
Mm.
So it's the same solution, right? Which is, and Ray is so dead-eye clear about this in his earlier writing. He uses this word. He says, we do not get rid of the surplus, what is it, the reserve army of
Mm.
the unemployed. We maintain the reserve army of the unemployed
Mm.
as a check on wage growth.
Mm.
It's just that we put that reserve army in a work program, and that actually makes them better as reserve army people because no one likes a work program. So they're going to be more aggressive about looking to get back into the workforce. So that's essentially their move, is to just say, do the exact same thing that other people do, which is cause all this disemployment, but put them in a work program, and hopefully that work program will be sort of more miserable, and they'll be more keen to undercut, wage demands.
Mm.
I think that latter bit's, I don't know, it's a little bit much, but I guess that would be where they'd say, therefore we get better inflation control because we kind of immiserate the workers more by attaching this work requirement. And through that process, we make them more eager to go back into the normal labor market. And when they're more eager to go back in the labor market, they'll be more willing to accept lower wages.
Mm.
But yeah, I don't know. That just all seems unnecessary to me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it does. And I'm not 100% convinced that it would actually work as well in the sense that um, in the way they imagine it. I'm not convinced that having that kind of minimum wage is necessary. Because suppose you've got like two sets of workers, right? And you've got like the minimum wage, reservation wage people, and you've got the kind of, let's call them high skilled for the purposes of argument, people, and they're in kind of different labor markets, and that's how things kind of function. There are different labor markets, really. Like, I'm not competing with people on minimum wage, right? And so that would only contain wages, if at all, in that minimum wage labour market, right? It wouldn't apply to the high skilled. And say you've got a wage price spiral in those sectors, in that sector of the labour market, then it seems like a job guarantee is just going to miss that. I don't think it is going to contain the wage price spiral.
yeah, yeah, I mean, that it cuts the other way as well. I always think because sometimes they'll say it pushes up wages. It just depends. Sometimes it pushes them down, sometimes it pushes them up, and you're like, well, how would it push up wages for anyone whose wage is not like in the bottom few percentiles of the wage
Mm.
distribution? But um, I think what they would say to that is they'd say, no, no. So what we're going to do is we'll cause a bunch of layoffs at the high end of the labor market, and then those people will be put on the minimum wage in this work program, and then they'll be really eager to get out
Okay.
of that. And
Cause
then
high layoffs with higher taxes or various policy mechanisms
yeah, through taxes.
through
That's usually
taxes.
how they say, yeah,
Yeah.
use
Okay.
amp up the taxes, cool down the economy. Those high earners will get put on minimum wage, and then that'll give them enough of a check to say, hey, go take a 10% cut, 20% cut, because it's better than this. I think that's not how they pitch it, but if you're trying to figure out like logically why did they say this, and it's like, okay, read Randy Ray from 1994. He'll shoot you straight on why they thought that made sense. But that's just a kind of a gruesome thing to say, to say, hey, well, we're just gonna kind of immiserate people, and again, just do the same thing that we uh, complain about, which is use disemployment to control inflation, but then say it's not really disemployment because we're forcing them on like a minimum wage community service thing.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, I agree. Okay, so I mean, it's been I've kept you for 2 hours, Matt. But it's been really fun to talk to you as I expected it would. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on. And I guess if you just want to plug everything, especially your YouTube channel, because we're on YouTube and people should check it out. Yeah, that'd be good.
Sure, yes. I'm at Matt Bruenig on YouTube. It's been a while since I posted, but I'm going to get back to it soon. At Twitter, at Matt Bruenig. Peoplespolicyproject.org is my think tank, if you will. And then I have a podcast at patreon.com/the Bruenigs that I do with my wife. So
Yeah. And although there hasn't been a video in a little while, there is plenty to be catching up with on Matt's channel. Somebody asked me earlier if you're ever going to upload some basketball videos to it.
yeah, no, probably not. We'll see. Yeah, I'm getting older, but I do have a review of a basketball that I bought on there. So
Oh, do you? Back all
you
the way
check that
back? I
out.
haven't been that far back.
Yeah, I think that was my first video. I did a parody of like an unboxing. This was like many, many years ago when I was just like sitting on a YouTube account doing
Yeah.
nothing with it. It struck me that it would be funny to pretend that I'm unboxing an Amazon Basics basketball. Like Amazon started selling a store brand
Yeah.
basketball, and I don't know, people got a kick out of it. So
Okay. Okay.
yeah,
I'll have to look at it. Um, but yeah. Anyway, so thanks again. And thanks to everyone in chat. We had a lot of people. We had like 300 at one point. So yeah, really good stream. See you all.